afternoon. Welcome back, I guess. So alumni weekend, right? So I suppose you're all here more often than I am. I read on the website that it's a series of academic talks, but I'm afraid I'm only a puppeteer. We'll see how I get on. So yeah, I move things around, hoping that other people will imagine that they're alive. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that, about a couple of the shows that I've worked on and why that might be interesting, or see whether there's any other interesting connections to draw on that. So I got into puppetry by accident, like most people who work in puppetry, and I went to a state comprehensive school where they didn't teach drama, and when I went to university, I started getting involved in theatre, and I started using puppets because no one had told me not to. I think if I'd done a drama GCSE or A-level, they would have taught me what was acceptable and what wasn't. And I put a very nice, clear set of parameters that you can understand. Singing's okay, dancing's okay, puppetry is a bit weird. So I didn't know that. So as I was putting together shows, there would be puppets in them. And it still seems to me less strange to have a character represented by something other than a person than to have a character suddenly start singing. But that's what convention does for you. So I did some plays. I tried acting, wasn't very good at it. I got into directing, and there were puppets in the shows, and people would say, "That's very interesting," which is English for wrong. So I would stop and try and see if I can make my way as a serious director of new plays. I really love working with writers. I still very much like working on text and structural analysis, but I was doing an English degree, and that's still the root of my work. But the puppets kept coming back. And I wanted to explore it and keep paying attention. And some of the questions that I was interested in at that point, and still am, is what makes a puppet different from an actor? What choice are you making when you put an object in place of a person in representing a fictional character? Can it do the same thing? How is it different when it tries? Why is it different? And what's happening when we watch them? And I work now as a designer of puppets and a director of puppetry. Mainly for theatre, but also teaching and workshops, consultancy and things like that. Very rarely I perform. Often I'm involved in the making, but I have a team of people who work with me on that. And so typically the flow of my year is to be working with creative teams on developing the designs for puppets and then getting them made either by myself or other people. And then working with the performers in the rehearsal room to teach them techniques, build up their confidence, get them to a position where they can perform in front of an audience. And that is more or less a living, apparently. So, just about. So I'm going to show you some pictures of some things. We can't do much. It's a beautiful building, isn't it? But it's got these lovely skylights, which means that the screen's slightly washed out. But we'll see how we go. For about 10 years, I worked on a show called Warhorse, which you might be familiar with. So Warhorse, if you don't know it, is an adaptation of a children's book by a very prolific children's author called Michael Walpurgo. And it was adapted into a stage play by the National Theatre, working with a very influential puppet company called Handspring, who are based in Cape Town. So I'd been working with Handspring immediately prior to the commissioning of this show on a different project called Tall Horse, confusingly, about a giraffe. And while we were making that show, the National Theatre came, Tom Morris, who was tasked with finding new collaborations for the National, and he produced a series of shows that were partnerships between the National and innovative young companies. And he wanted to do something with puppetry, and he found this book. He said his mum sent him a copy of the book and said, "Oh, maybe this is the one." He'd been turning over a few possible candidates, and he said, "What if we do this show about a horse?" And Basil and Adrian from Handspring read the book, and the book is narrated by the horse. It's about the experience of horses in the First World War, and it's narrated by a hunter called Joey, who grows up on a farm and is sold into the army as a cavalry horse, and then ends up improbably doing various other jobs during the war on both sides, gets captured by the German army and works there, and on it goes. And Handspring said, we'll do it, but not if it's a talking horse. So we're interested in animals, and we're interested in puppetry. So I worked with them to develop we took us about 2 years to develop the show between 2005 and 2007 before it first went on. So I was part of the creative team during that period, supporting Basil Major and Tom and all the other brilliant creatives who came on. And then I performed in the show for 2 seasons at the National, and then directed the puppetry thereafter at the West End and New York and Toronto and then Berlin, which I think was the first play about the First World War to play in Berlin, which was a pretty interesting project to do. So that's very interesting to watch, to do the same bit of puppetry and to teach puppeteers in different locations, people from different performing backgrounds, playing to different audiences with different expectations. On Broadway is very different from the theatre audience in Berlin, for example, or even in London. You know, the journey, which became very satisfying because you had done it before, was of taking a group of performers, most of whom had never done any puppetry at all, and taking them within the space of about 3 or 4 months to the point where audience members would come up to them after the show and say it was the most beautiful puppetry they'd ever seen. So in terms of the arc for a performer going through that process, that was very lovely to be stewarding that. So if you've got questions about Warhorse, I'll try and get through all the stuff and we'll chat about that later. But it's a really good example because it's changed the way that people look at puppetry and the way people understand what's possible for puppets on stage. Why is Warhorse so successful? It's the most successful play in the history of the National Theatre. It's won 25 major awards or something. I had to research this because I gave a presentation at Warhorse to my son's Year 6 primary school class yesterday morning. And Warhorse has just gone on tour again. It was opened in Wimbledon a few weeks ago, and it'll be here in December. So if you haven't seen it, it's coming. So it's a First World War setting, and it's a sentimental story of attachment between Albert, the farm boy, and Joey the horse, who are separated and each go through the hell of the war before they come back together again. But even here, the fact that Joey is a horse is transformative. It isn't a friendship in the normal sense that we're used to in that kind of fiction. It's not the separation of romantic lovers. There's an attachment to an animal which is kind of pure and generous by definition. You know, Albert's no human relationship can be as simple and innocent as Albert's connection with the horse. Basil Jones from Handspring describes the centrality of Joey as a kind of radical theatre act. We'd never seen a theatre piece of that scale have a puppet at the centre of it before, as a proper character, but we'd also never seen one that genuinely placed an animal as a major character in a show, partly because how do you do that? You know, we've seen Lion King and other plays where an animal is at the centre of the story, but actually it's a proxy for a human. It's a kind of avatar. But here we made a really clear and conscious choice to invite the audience to see the horse as a real horse, as no more or less intelligent than a horse. And whenever we anthropomorphize it, it reduces the impact of the story. The story works best when we understand that Joey and Topthorn are horses. So we love animals, and we never really know what they're thinking. So we spend a lot of our time guessing and fantasizing about what animals are thinking. And there are some good philosophical essays about this, which I won't go into. So, you know, we love to believe that the dog runs to greet us because it loves us, but we don't really know for sure. We can't help but make those little narratives of motivation when we watch a wildlife documentary or watch animals in the forest or the park. And something similar happens when we watch puppets. So we find it really hard not to project onto them. So when we have a puppet animal that behaves in a way that's well observed and the movement's plausible, that effect gets magnified. So our projection gets stronger. We're projecting onto the animal as a as an animal and projecting onto the puppet because of the way the puppet works. But these puppets are a little bit different from some of the other puppets, and people used to say about Warhorse, I don't know if you can call it puppetry. Well, you can. But let's look at a couple of, here's a couple of classic modern traditional puppets. So over the years, puppets have been used in a lot of ways. There's a rich history of traditional work, of folk art, of satirical work, and the style and the scale of the puppet is suited to its situation and use. So a glove puppet, it's the size of a hand, but it works to an audience probably at least as big as this one. So it needs to use a physical language and a vocal language that can reach the back of that space, and that's at odds with the scale of the puppet itself. So there's a particular style that comes with that. A string marionette or a rod marionette, like you'd see in Salzburg or Sicily, they work within a formal theatre that's been built for them so that the puppeteer can be hidden and the puppet can hang in a little doll's house design, set design, and they have a particular style of movement that suits that space. The modern TV puppet style that's become so well known to everyone from adverts and TV, pioneered by the Hensons through the 60s and 70s and 80s, takes advantage of what the camera can do, and allows a kind of speech-led comedy that fills the frame. The best Muppets are kind of ready to burst out of your TV, and their kind of mania is sort of expertly scaled to hit those spots and work to the edges of that frame. So puppets can be as ephemeral as a hand shadow on a cave wall, or as intricate as the Wayang Kulit shadows in Java or the Ping Chi in China. Puppets can be huge, like a carnival effigy, or they can be kind of compelling and terrifying, like the creature effects in Star Wars or Alien or Jurassic World. We actually really live in a society that's quite saturated with puppetry, and we don't really think about it very much. We're presented with a lot of objects that perform, that kind of pull our strings a little bit, and sometimes we don't connect them. And maybe I'll mention later about how that kind of extends into the digital world as well. But what's kept me working on theatre puppets is a topic that Hans Spring and I were interested in exploring back in the late 1990s, and we're still developing approaches to, which is about puppet theatre that breathes. So the horse works as well as it does because it specifically taps into an additional level, a kind of emotional level. So as we, I talked about the frame for each puppet type and how the puppet suits it. This style was developed in smallish theatre spaces with improving technical resources. Hans Spring used to say that their work starts with a dark studio theatre with no light, and you put the puppet in space, and then you light it, and then you can build out from there. And I think that allies with my experience when we were starting to work with puppets in small theatres. You'd always start with a small frame with a detail and build up. And that allows you to explore gestures and behaviour that's more nuanced, that's more specific, that's more detailed. You're not needing to hit the back of a crowd at the seaside anymore. It's not necessarily about the grotesque or the caricature. And so you're looking for moments of genuine emotion and pathos, and the puppet body allows you maybe to make that strange. So I think what the team from the National, led by Tom Morris, saw was the potential to take a style of puppetry that was already quite successful in festival context and small theatres and touring kind of environment, and try and put that on a bigger stage through a production like Warhorse. And what we found is that puppetry really loves being on a big stage, and it communicates emotion and thought at least as clearly as the human actors are able to. And one of the nicest compliments we've had was in New York when we made the Wars in New York, and Alex, who invited me here, said the fact that was in that production, so you can talk to him about it. And one of the very eminent stage actors who was playing one of the human characters in the show came up after rehearsal and said, "If we can be as clear as the puppets can, then this will go down really well." And that sort of stayed with me as a thing that I offer to the performers I'm working with. So we give our puppeteers that challenge to be clearer than the actors, and we give the actors we work with are trying to be as clear as the puppets. So when a character is a large animal, we need more than one puppeteer to work it. And one of the key challenges for those puppeteers is to bring their ideas together and to quieten down three minds to create one mind. If you're going to be a horse or an elephant or a cow or a rhino or any of those things, you need to try and imagine what that animal would think. And if you've got three busy minds in the middle of it, then it gets muddy very quickly. So the first step in that practice is to breathe together. So all three or four or more of those puppeteers are breathing together to find each other, to listen to each other. It allows them to share a state of tension and emotion. It allows them to communicate with each other without speaking. And our goal really is for the puppeteering team to be able to take a decision with as much fluidity and ease as a single mind as you might do if you were an actor on your own. All acting is better when it feels like improvising. Puppeteering is no different. But the performers need to know their technique so well and connect with each other so easily that they can move all of their conscious attention onto responding and reacting to what's happening around them. And that was another one of the principles that really underpinned the change in the puppetry style that we explored through Wars, which is saying that if you're really going to represent an animal, the thing you need to be doing more than anything else, you need to be being alive and you need to be being responsive, and that means you need to be improvising. And when we first did the show, other directors used to come and ask, how did you choreograph all that stuff? It must have taken, how did you have enough rehearsal time to coordinate and plan all of those movements? And the answer is that we didn't. It's that we taught the people to think like a horse. We taught the people how the puppet moves, and we worked with them to get an understanding of their work, and we trusted them. And then when we trust them still every night to go out, and there are parts of each scene, parts of the show, the best bits of the show, actually, the bits that really connect with the audience, are when those puppeteers are improvising and responding in the moment. So with an animal character, those thoughts are really simple, but we also try and do the same thing when we're manipulating a human puppet, like this is one from a National Theatre of Scotland production called James II, where the memory of the king as a child is represented with a puppet. So when you're on a human puppet, the puppeteers are playing as complex a psychological journey as the actors are. But they're aiming to find those transitions and moments of emotion with the same kind of clarity. Can the puppet act as well as a person? Can it hold enough life that you're willing to ignore the bodies of the puppeteers around it and connect with the inner life of that character? The puppet also allows us to experiment with scale. So this is a figure from the RSC's As You Like It, and it takes several puppeteers to work that puppet. They're easily forgotten as the huge puppet kind of moves. Its scale is set so that it fits naturally to fill the stage with the span of its arms. And the actors likewise are kind of dwarfed by that character which served God. And it gives their relationship a kind of dynamic power that you couldn't get any other way. So once we've used the puppet, possibly for a design effect like that, we're still looking to try and find a kind of grounding in psychology and emotion to underpin it. So another experiment with scale on this style of work is this, which is called the hatchling, which is a giant dragon puppet. And part of this experiment is to take the principle of those three horse puppeteers improvising and kind of expand it to a ludicrous degree. The puppet is the size of a double-decker bus. There are 15 puppeteers underneath it at a time, and they basically improvise moving through a city centre for 7 hours continuously. So we have a team of 36 puppeteers who rotate kind of constantly through the puppet, so you don't even see them coming and going. But we did this in Wakefield in August, and in Plymouth a few years before. And the puppet wakes up at midday and keeps walking around the city for 7 hours until it goes to sleep again. And it just reacts to whatever happens. So it's a sort of durational art event, and it's sort of, it's not a show in the sense of the narrative is that it encounters whatever it encounters. If there's a police siren, it'll hear it. If there's a fight or a heckler or a child that will investigate, she'll put her head into the branch of Greg's or a perfume shop. But it's also a kind of attempt to radically expand this idea of 3 puppeteers improvising to a massive team. And some of them are 5 meters away from each other. We're trying to find different strategies for how you can kind of build this imaginary creature in this space above you where everybody can kind of connect with him. And the goal with that puppet, and the goal with all the puppets, I've realised as we develop, particularly with that one, is that we're trying to embody thought. So there's a kind of school of a theory called embodied cognition at the moment about how thoughts go into your body, about how your body is changed by thoughts. And it helps us as puppeteers to think about the human as an animal when we're doing it with a human, because animals are less guarded in the way their thoughts inhabit their physicality than humans are typically. It's very polite for us to not show each other what we're thinking. It's considered courteous. But what we're really interested in seeing with a huge puppet like this, and the speed it works at is quite slow, you can see you can notice her see something. There's a change in her body when she sees something. You might see a change in the rhythm of her breath, of the tension in her haunches. You might see her rise up in her toes. You can see that thought move through the body, and how the change in the body and physical tension in that body allows you to feel very viscerally what she is experiencing. And after a while, I've been starting to wonder about how this happens and why this happens. So several years ago, I was lucky enough to get an artist in residence grant, which I spent at Queen Mary's in London. And I went up and down the country interviewing researchers in neuroscience and experimental psychology and philosophy to try and understand a basic question of what's happening in our brain when we imagine that something is alive that isn't alive. Turns out brain science is really complicated. So there's a lot going on there, and I won't try and get through all the details, or we'll be here all day. But part of the journey for me was I had quite a specific question to ask, but of course the first thing that gets pushed back at you as well, you need to get your basic terms understood here. So how do you know anything? What do you see? How do you know what you're seeing? You've got this brain locked inside this bone box, and it's got no way of connecting with what's outside it other than these eyes that are imperfect, these ears and the senses that you've got, and all of those are kind of flawed. And then all of that information comes in. How do we recognise that something is a person? Well, how do we recognise that there's a surface or an edge? How do we recognise a sound or a colour? So there are a couple of studies that were really interesting along this journey. This one on the left is a Hyder and Simmels film from 1944, which is still relevant, excitingly. And if you don't know this, I might pick this up so I won't keep telling you away from it. This one, if you don't know it, it's a little animation. It's a very rudimentary animation, quite awkward kind of movement, and it's just about these 3 shapes, and they move around this box, and they smash in the box, and it's impossible to watch this film, which you can find on YouTube, without ascribing a narrative to it and characterization to these little shapes. They're not characters. They're not Disney. They are just a ball and 2 triangles, but you give them characters very quickly. This other one on the right is more sophisticated and more recent, and it's called the Wolfpack effect, and it talks about direction of gaze, and the red dot and the green dot are moving, and all the little arrowheads are moving randomly. But if the arrowheads are pointing at the green dot, which is the sheep, then they seem like wolves. And if the arrows are pointing at the wolf, then they seem like sheep. And it's just really simple, and it's just very powerful in terms of how convincing it becomes. So what's really fascinating in all of this is that yes, there are systems in your brain that recognise faces, and we know all those kind of things that we love to spot in a drain cover or a chair and things, and you go, oh, that's a face. There are systems in your brain that recognise body, the shapes of bodies, and there's the system that's sometimes called the mirror neurons or action response network, which seems to suggest, and puppetry directors love this, that when we see a convincing action, we recognise and understand it by feeling or imagining it in our own bodies, sort of. I'm butchering it slightly, but there's a when you see someone else reach out, a little part of your brain that's to do with the preparation for you reaching out triggers. And if you see them reach out with their right hand, but you're left-handed, it'll be your left hand that triggers, not the right hand. So there's something going on there that's to do with mapping yourself onto other bodies. I'm not going to pretend I understand it, but it's exciting. And among all these other systems that seem to work in parallel, it is one that's triggered by people, animals, and these videos, and I'm confident puppets, although mysteriously no one's funding research into puppets. So there's a part of your brain that lights up when you see animacy, they're calling it, which is so any movement that seems to have intention. Even when it's like the hydroincimal triangles, completely independent of any other contextual information that would make you think it's a person or a thing or something you're interested in. So all of this acts in parallel, and we guess what is happening based on all of these little imperfect bits of information, all of these little systems that are giving us often conflicting information. And we're filling in all those gaps and combining our conscious perception and our subconscious perception. And we redirect our attention to whatever we think needs it. There's a nice quote in one of the books. This is from a book called Consciousness by Gerald Aderman and Giulio Tononi. Every act of perception is to some degree an act of creation, and every act of memory is to some degree an act of imagination. And the memory bit isn't that relevant to this, but I feel like the quote wasn't planned without it. But the fact that every act of perception is an act of creation is very useful, and just to foreground how we build the world around us. So it shouldn't be a surprise that puppets can stimulate our emotions. So our brain systems are on hair triggers, and it's a lot safer to be alert to life where there might not be any. Anyone who's everyone's flinched at the movement of a branch or plastic bag in the wind. It's better to see it where it's not than to miss it where it exists. So the skilled and dedicated puppeteer, it learns how to keep stimulating that response and build a series of actions that make it almost impossible to believe that there isn't life there, that there isn't intention and mind there. People sit differently when the puppet comes on stage. That was one of the first things I noticed when I was a student and we were putting puppets in shows. I would sit in one of the nice things about being a director is you get to sit with the audience and sit at the back and cross your fingers and watch through your, hope it's going to go all right. But then the puppet would come on and everyone would shift in their seats and kind of lean forward, and I found that really interesting, and that continues to be the case. It may be something to do with the fact that it's supposed to be quite it may be something to do with the fact that the puppet isn't giving you the cues that you're expecting, that the means of communication is different from the actor. But it reminded me that in the 90s, when I was doing my literature degree, I read into a theory called reader response theory. So reader response theory is probably out of fashion by now, but it says you're reading a piece of text, and say the text says, Susan ran down the road, you make a little image in your head, and then it said sweating, and then you change the little picture in your head, panting wildly, change the little image in your head a little bit more, her tail wagging in the and there's no certainty attached to your reading of the world. You're constantly adjusting, you're constantly making these little changes. So the explanation from Edelman and Timoni and the other things that we're exploring seems to be that that's how all perception is working, that we're constantly juggling several different interpretations of what's happening around us. But the audience is not passive. That's the main thing. We talk sometimes about the difference between a cinema blockbuster and a good theatre show. And in the blockbuster, you kind of sit back and it washes over you, and you don't need to do anything. And in the great theatre show, you're pulled forward out of your seat, and your imagination comes up on the stage with the people who are up there. So I don't think the audience is passive in any theatre context, but puppetry makes that creative act and that creative contract more explicit. So he's not really in Denmark, he's not really a prince. That man isn't really dead. But you make all the effort to imagine those things. And all we're doing actually is giving you some plausible cues, and we're giving you permission to do that together. So one of the strange things about being a sort of specialist director in the theatre context is that I'm quite often asked, could you bring some magic to our show? And you think, oh gosh. And I can't bring the magic because it's the audience who bring the magic, it's the audience who do the magic. We can bring you some skills and some expertise in how to invite them to enjoy that and how to invite them to be conscious of that a little bit more. Why doesn't Puppet do that so well? So when we watch Judi Dench say, play, I don't know, Lady Bracknell, there's a sort of plausible map between her body and the character's body. In some productions, she'll be dressed in period dress to help you imagine that she's where she says she is. But when the puppet takes a role, there's a kind of tension between what we're seeing and what we're imagining. There's a gap, and we like gaps. We quite like space. So here's a giant puppet lion where there's literally gaps in the body, and the audience fill them in. So we know from kind of just basic perception, understanding of perception, that if you see two halves of a tiger with a tree in between them, that you don't imagine that there are two half tigers in front of you. You imagine there's a complete tiger and there's a tree in front of it. And here we know, and when we start to design puppets, that if you leave a gap in the image, as long as the silhouette remains convincing, the people will fill in the gap and they will see a full body. So the performers can create better movement with this puppet than with a complete puppet that's fully mechanical. So the sculpture that you can imagine in that gap is much better than anything that I can make. So the cat that we can make, the gaps in it, is much more cat-like than the puppet we can make that's complete. And on other levels also, there's a gap between the truth that you see and the truth that you recognise when we're working with puppets. Function follows form, follows function. We need to make a body that's light enough to handle. We need to make a body that's strong enough to withstand repeated performances. We need a silhouette that can be recognised. We need joints that are flexible enough to allow movement. And we might also choose, you'll see in some of these images, a visual texture that has a metaphorical meaning. When a puppet tries to imitate a body, when a puppet tries to be realistic or lifelike, it can only really fail in a variety of interesting ways. So that's not that interesting a job to do. So I prefer to make a puppet that celebrates its difference from the represented body. And that heightens that kind of miracle of belief. So the puppet that insists to the audience that it is a puppet, that reminds us that it's a dead thing, an object, in spite of all the evidence that your brain is giving you that it's alive and it's breathing and falling and hoping and loving. That puppet is the one that you don't forget. It draws attention to that magic that you're performing when you see life and empathise with an imaginary being. And so when the puppet designer works, they work on several levels. They'll be responding to the writer, to the director, to the imagined audience, what kind of audience are we expecting and how do they read things, what's their frame of reference, what textures and materials that have meaning to them. There'd be the content and the material in the play thematically. We need to do an analysis of anatomy. We need to do a selective design of how that body might work. You can't make all the joints. You can't make all the joints in the human body or the animal body. If you do, it will just collapse. You haven't got enough hands to hold them all up. So the writing that the puppet designer does is about choosing which movements are going to be expressive of that character. There's no perfect eagle puppet. There's only the eagle puppet that's right for this story. So the first thing we need to do is read through the scripts and see whether that's how high that eagle's flying, or whether it's picking things up with its claws, or what it does with its beak. You know, we need to find out what the personality of that character is in terms of how it fits within the other action of the story. So it's a sculpture, it's not an imitation. We want to find a paraphrase of a neck or a refinement of an arm. And that takes us into different territory, into metaphorical territory. And once we've grounded those characters in a psychological context, when they relate properly, then we can shift them into transcending reality. So here, this is a puppet from Aida at the Paris Opera a few years ago, and for most of the opera, the puppet represented the character of Aida, but in the arias, solo arias, the singer and the puppet would work together, and the puppet would quite often float in the air or do movement that was more like dance, something more metaphorical, allowing us to see the divide itself and the split and the tension between two different expressions of the character. So the puppet, because it is a metaphor, invites us to see more metaphors, invites us to see life in objects that aren't yet moving. But when the cues are right, we can't resist seeing life. So the puppet being alive is just what you see. You're not making an effort to do it. It's as undeniable as the colour of a garment. Is it a mind? Not sure. We spend every day trying to imagine people's minds. Every interaction in the supermarket or the departmental meeting or on a first date, we are projecting possible motivations and biases and interpretations onto the behaviour of other people and the bodies that we can see. And with even less oversight on the bodies that we're not concentrating on. And the available evidence seems to suggest we get it wrong quite often. But I think there's something about the work of dramatists and the work of, in my case, puppeteers and puppet designers and performers, about minds that have been written or performed and the purpose of that action and the benefit of that action. The written mind, the performed mind is more available to us and more vivid and probably more consistent and coherent than a real one. It's constructed to do that, it's imagined to do that. The situations that it's been put in are there to reveal something about how that mind might be. And those imagined minds are accessible in a way that your rivals or children or lovers will never quite be. So maybe that's part of why an imaginative engagement with fiction or dramatisation is so fundamental to us. The theatre is a place where we can exercise our ability to meet other minds, a kind of gym for empathy, where the game of imagining ourselves into another mind is given a kind of satisfying shape. So I want to say that puppetry heightens that game and invites the performers and audience to embark on that together. And once we've opened up the world for the audience to connect with an object, we can move out of that strictly plausible world into surrealism and metaphor and poetry. What does it mean for us that we can feel empathy for a puppet? Is that rational or helpful? What does it mean for robotics and virtual worlds? Is it encouraging? Maybe. If the roboticists and the avatar makers will listen to the puppeteers a bit more, maybe we can help. available for work. So yeah, maybe it's the robots that will say that. And that's the end of my prepared bit. So I wanted to leave the rest of the session for discussion between and among us, and questions. If you enjoyed this kind of, or if you're interested in these topics, I wrote some books you can look at. If I was more entrepreneurial, I probably would have brought some, but then if I was more entrepreneurial, I probably wouldn't be able to write. So there's a book about warhorse and a book about tall horse and a book about puppetry technique for non-puppeteers and professionals alike, how to do puppetry without having to make any puppets. But yeah, I'll leave it there and I'll start to invite questions. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much. Really interesting. Oh, I use that word.
Yeah.
Magnificent. I just wanted to know, were you involved in the puppetry in My Neighbour Totoro? And if you were, can you explain how that, if you're not giving away a secret, the giant puppet was created?
So yes, I was. So there's a production that was at the Barbican in the last couple of years of the very popular Studio Ghibli anime film, My Neighbour Totoro, which is a Japanese children's film, and it's a very beautiful production directed by Fenner McDermott. And the puppetry is designed by Basil Twist, who is an American, a brilliant American puppet designer, who works, he's very high concept and a very sort of visionary. So my company worked with him to develop the puppet designs and make them real. And we've collaborated with him and the Joe Henson Company in the States. And we're remaking some of those puppets right now. I was there yesterday in the workshop. And the show's going into the West End from March. So we've got until Christmas to get the puppets made and then go into rehearsal. We're not allowed to show any pictures of the puppets from Totoro other than little pictures of chickens and things like that. So I saved back some extra pictures in case people were interested. That come up, yeah. So and there's a goat and some corn and some chickens, and there's lots of puppeteers on stage, as you can see. Well, you know, if you want to make something really big, then you have to blow it up a bit. So there is some inflatable going on in there, but there's also a lot of fur. It's a secret. But there's a lot of people involved. You know, when you get to the end of the show and you know 25 people turn up on stage, they've all been working really hard. Some of them have been inside things, and some of them have been under things.
And the bravery of that actor as well to get right to contact.
Oh yeah.
Oh wow.
So there's a lovely moment when there's a gigantic puppet that's sort of 2.5 meters high. So he's laying on his back, and this little girl climbs onto his belly and rests on the belly, and it looks impossible because he's all soft, but it is impossible.
While we're talking about connections with Japan and so on, are you informed why I've been connected with the Japanese tradition like bunraku?
Yeah, the bunraku is a really strong inspiration for a lot of this work, and definitely through the handspring. And I try not to claim to be doing it, although sometimes you hear that from Western makers. There's something about Western theatre traditions that's it's sort of splendidly iconoclastic, wasteful, greedy. It's sort of amazing. I think it's part of the reason why British and American theatre is so kind of dynamic. We're really, really impatient. And so bunraku is an extraordinary tradition. They form still 18th century texts, and you can see it in Tokyo sometimes, and I think it's Osaka. The story goes that when you first enter the theatre, you work on the feet of the puppet. They have 3 puppeteers per puppet, and similar way that you saw in some of these other images. Yeah, the puppet is not huge, but kind of that size. And you do 10 years on the feet before you're allowed to work up to the hand. And then when you've done the hand, only the masters are allowed to operate the head of the Bunraku puppet. And the masters are allowed to not be hooded, and the other puppeteers are hooded. It's extraordinary to watch, I think, and it's really interesting in the tradition that they're performing still the same texts from the 18th century, and they're real pot boilers. You kind of get slightly expecting it to be some extraordinary deep ritual, but it's like a soap opera. It's kind of brilliant little adventure stories about bandits and things, but with this beautiful musical accompaniment and this kind of artistry that's come from so much discipline. So yeah, I think we're all inspired by it, and our cultural contexts makes us smash it up a bit and try and do it differently. So we're mischievous with it, and that's good for us too.
I just wondered if you, in all of your massive research with the puppet and the brain, if you looked into how early years or younger children were affected by the puppets and by how the body is changed by thoughts, or if you stayed with the big people.
I think I stayed with the first principles. I didn't get that specific. I mean, there's some amazing stuff about early youth development in some of the books that I read, and the self-illusion one, priesthood, is it? It's really amazing about how early in your life you start to perceive yourself and other bodies, and there's a quite interesting kind of area of exploration about that. Yeah, no, not really, but I do, there's a kind of separate strand of puppetry, particularly in a therapeutic context, in an applied context, where children will talk to a puppet where they won't talk to an adult, and other children will talk through a puppet in a way they wouldn't talk, and that is very inspiring to think about what it is to transplant yourself into another voice, how liberating that can be. I think also sometimes puppeteers are shy actors. So you get to show off without everyone looking at you, or you get to imagine and play in a space where it's exciting. In the first year of Wars, I got to play a 10-year-old girl because she was a puppet in that first production, and I'm not going to get that role any other time. So you get when you're a puppeteer, you get to play all sorts of things, and I think that really appeals to everyone of any age. People also say, it made me feel like a child again when they're watching puppetry, and I think that's probably says more about cultural norms than it does about puppetry. But yeah, it's a very instinctive thing, it's a very basic thing to imagine life in something, and to play and to pick up objects and pretend they're alive. And we teach ourselves to stop doing it in adolescence, and we're not given places where we're allowed to do it again, so actually probably should. Yeah. Hello. She's going to come with a microphone.
I just wonder whether you could say anything about Aida, the production with the puppet there, because it seems to me that puppets have defined roles in plays, whereas if you have an opera on the stage, then you can't replace the singer, right? The singer has to be there singing.
Singer,
So,
yeah.
yes, so, and you have puppet beside it, representing the same
Yeah.
personality. So how does it work?
Puppets are really good in opera, I think, although, and I'd love to do more of it. Partly it was, the director came to us and said, we'd like to try making Aida and Abenastro into puppets in this story. And we did some workshops exploring how the singer could be involved in that image. So one of the things that we're looking at is how you can be a puppeteer without touching the puppet. And that definitely is the case. We quite often, when sometimes we'll do a show where the puppet gets picked up during the action, and we'll definitely be talking to puppeteers about how far away from the puppet you are when you start puppeteering. So there's something the puppeteers are doing when they are holding the puppet is that they're sending their energy into that object. They're putting their focus into that object, and so you're giving that puppet, that object, that area of space in the room a kind of magnified energy of focus. And so when the audience look at when they see your face, they follow your eye back into the character. So you can do that from further away, and if you can sing through the puppet and bend it around, then you can get a sense of how the singer would work with that. So what we started to explore with Elizabeth Llewellyn, who's a lovely British soprano who works with us in a workshop, and she was really interested in how she can sometimes be holding the puppet, sometimes manipulating it and singing for it, but also sometimes watching herself and kind of having an out-of-body experience while another body interacts with the other characters. So on a level where opera stagings are quite often non-literal, especially nowadays, it allows a way of expressing that character, giving that character actually a kind of more nuanced status, and the range of bringing Sondra Rokowski, as it was, in there to sometimes handle the puppet was really powerful, I think. So there are some other puppet opera experiments, and very often the singer is one of the puppeteers. So you'll have an image of 2 or 3 puppeteers working with the puppet, and the singer might be what we would call the secondary puppeteer, but providing the voice. And actually that's one of the ways we learned about how important breath was, because when the puppeteer operating the head wasn't breathing with the singer, we just couldn't see it. So as they started to understand how the breath control of the singer determines the emotion, the mood, the decisions are made, it's also very interesting, in terms of the phrasing and the timing of the body in puppetry. We spend a lot of our rehearsal time in play looking at timing and where the decision comes. Birdie tells you where the decision comes. It's not up to you. You hear it, and if you try doing a decision a couple of bars earlier or a couple of bars later, it just doesn't land. So there's something beautiful about working in music theatre where you have a lot of those decisions taken away from you, and you can concentrate on technique and beauty and detail.
The singer is operating the puppet.
The singer can be operating the puppet sometimes, but also she doesn't have to be. Yeah.
I just wondered, you were talking a lot about the audience's response is so key in terms of visualizing and making it a real entity.
Yeah.
In Warhorse or in any of the others, did something not land that made you change the way the puppet moved, or did the audience response ever determine a change in the puppet?
Yeah, definitely. I think it happens all the time. And if I'm teaching, I'll quite often we'll quite often be working on a tabletop to start off with kind of moderately sized puppets, and people be improvising and playing. And we'll talk about the gap between the stage and the audience, and as a metaphor as well as a genuine physical gap. And you start to feel it as the audience kind of drift away. And as a puppetry director, I sometimes say that there's only one note, which is it clear? And you find different ways of asking the performer that question. Can we make this more clear? And that's not about there not being mystery or there not being ambiguity. It's about being in control of that. So what you'll start to find is that if you leave too much ambiguity, if you don't resolve, give the audience an opportunity to really understand what that thought was and what that what the sequence is, they start to drift away and they start to feel like I feel when I watch the ballet, which is that I don't understand how to watch this. I feel like I'm not educated in the right way to know how to interpret what I'm watching. And that's for me to educate myself, of course, but you never want that from your audience in that moment. So once you realise that the audience are blaming themselves when you do it badly, that's not fair. So we definitely have that. That's part of the discipline that we invite the puppeteers to take responsibility for. And so there's two good examples from Wars. One is the opposite in a way, which is that I used to do the foal at the very beginning. So at the beginning of Wars, there's an empty stage and some little birds on sticks flying around. There's someone drawing in a sketchbook. And then the lights come up on this little baby horse at the back of the stage. It's quite far away. It's kind of in the half darkness and it does nothing. And you're in the Olivier and you can hear 1,000 people going, is that it? And they're going, and we would just breathe for about 20 seconds before we did anything. And then you can hear them leaning forward and you can hear people very quietly nudging their husband and saying, he's breathing. And you're teaching them how to watch this puppet. So by withholding that first bit of movement for a little bit of time, you can start to feel the people leaning forward and going, oh, okay, it's not about sitting back. This is what we're watching. I'm being asked to pretend that that's a baby horse, even though it doesn't have any knees. And all of those other things that are strange about it. It hasn't got any skin, it hasn't got nostrils, and the ears made of leather, and okay, fine. And then the horse hears the first thing it hears or sees the first thing it sees, and we have a little sequence that's about, this is what a horse looks like when it sees something. Here's a little sneeze for get you a laugh, and release some tension that way as well. So that's about that gap. But I think probably the other example is the character of Emily as a puppet, which, so in the story of Wars, 2 scenes into the second half, the horses have been captured after a disastrous cavalry charge and they are taken to a French farmhouse, which has been which is a clearing station for the German army behind their trenches. Well, they don't have trenches yet, but behind their lines. And there's a little girl who lives on the farm, and she is. We were keen to kind of not sentimentalise a girl who lives in the war zone. So she's not terrified or traumatised by anything. She's not cute. She's a little urchin, and she throws stones at the crows, and she searches the soldiers' bodies for chocolate. And that character was played by a puppet, partly because Handspring had a long tradition of using human puppets. And she's a strange-looking little puppet. Adrian carves the faces with these deep gouges in them, so she looked kind of strange. But the main thing, I think, the reason we stopped using the puppet was that it's a bit too late to introduce that language to the audience. So you've watched the whole of the first half, you've got to the interval, you understand how this works. The animals are puppets, and people, apart from that cavalry charge scene where there were just too many people and then the people in the background were puppets, that's fine. So then to introduce a character that's a puppet was disorienting for the audience. And if people were like, oh, I don't know, I can't connect with the character. And there were 2 ways to solve that. One was to use an actor for the character, which we did. And the other one would have been to introduce a puppet child in the first half and teach the audience that early on as well. And then that, you'd be able to do it. And, part of the principle was we wanted to say that the child connects to the animals in a way that's purer than the way that the adults do, and that was part of that. So that didn't really land the way we wanted it to. So yeah, we just gone in a box somewhere.
I have 2 questions.
Am I right to do that? Yeah.
One is, would you agree that we are all born puppeteers? In the sense that as children, most of us will have played with soft toys and put them into a scenario and thereby surmounting our troubles or whatever.
I speak as a sculptor and spiritual art therapist. And the second question is, do you work at all in education, encouraging people who have, as you mentioned, lost that, not that skill, but that freedom to continue doing that through your work?
Thank you. I do agree. I think that, I think we have a need to, especially in those formative years, and particularly, my son's 10 now, so I've been watching him go through various stages of development, but right now he needs to tell little stories. He uses cars rather than figures, but but they've got characters and things happen in those stories, and they go through triumph and disaster and chaos and all those things. And I think you need to do that. You need to rehearse these possible eventualities and see what it feels like to be different things. There's a difference between playing and puppetry, which is to do with someone watching. So while I think we're all puppeteers, I don't think we all do puppetry, because I think the sharing of that is too intimate for most children. So, the difference between playing puppetry is that someone's watching it and that you're trying to communicate something, you're shaping that experience or that narrative for somebody. And so that's a big step, I think, for someone to make. Yeah, some people will take that lightly and have no problem sharing that stuff, and some people will find that very challenging. I don't work much in education outside of kind of professional context, so I've worked on an MA program in Wimbledon, and I do professional training, but there is a lot of good work happening in terms of puppetry therapy. I think it's interesting that, because I said earlier about how we're surrounded by puppets, but we kind of join up the gaps between them and understand it as one thing. There's sometimes a bit of anxiety in the puppetry community, professional puppetry community, which is quite small. Like lots of small communities, they get territorial, and so they're worried when non-puppeteers are getting puppetry jobs, and I think. And then sometimes you read reviews of shows where the puppetry isn't very good, and the reviewer said, "Puppetry is amazing." And I think, oh, they don't know. And so there's all sorts of complex things going on about who isn't doing puppetry. And I always think that everyone should do it, because the more puppetry there is, the better people understand it. And the more bad puppetry there is, the more we'll enjoy the good puppetry. I mean, we all sing. I sing really badly. It doesn't stop me appreciating someone who's good at singing. In fact, it helps. So yeah, I think because of the impact of Warbles, there's more puppetry in school teaching and drama within a drama context. So it's certainly a lot more something that people aren't embarrassed to do. I might get invited into a drama school or something, but in a wider social context, yeah, I think there's a space for people to develop. There are participatory arts practitioners, definitely, and I think that would be a good thing to keep encouraging. Yeah. One more. We're out of time, but here's one more. Oh, she's still better on it. Oh no. Let's substitute.
Would you share with us maybe your most moving experience of all the work that you've done so far? Maybe something that you went home and you just lay on a pillow and you went, oh my God, that really moved me to a depth and created an impact that went beyond my wildest imagination, and that couldn't have been done with a human, but it was something about the puppeting that made that happen.
Yeah, this project of the giant dragon, which I'll say I can find again, is this took a long time to develop. It was just an idea that a producer had. She said, "Oh, I've got this idea about doing something with the dragon. It's about migration. It's about being in a space where you're a problem, where you're perceived as a problem, and how people will react to a strange presence in their city that feels possibly monstrous but is also innocent. And so the global story of the piece is that there's a big egg appears in the city, and then the egg hatches and the dragon comes out of it. And there's actually two dragon puppets, one that's slightly smaller, it's only the size of a single decker bus, and there's one that's slightly bigger, which is the size of a double decker bus, and each of them does a 7-hour improv. And in order to make it interesting, we work with some local community groups. So we teach 30 people to be performers in each place. We've done it twice, once in Plymouth and once in Wakefield. And we work with community groups to create little interventions that happen along the route. So if you were to follow the dragon for more than an hour or so, something weird would happen. People would suddenly start singing, or there would be a little weird kind of dance thing, and we try to keep the things abstract, and we don't rehearse them. So the puppeteers don't know what's going to happen, and the performers, who are volunteers and normal people, don't really know how it's going to play out. And they turn up outside Burger King and they do their funny little thing, and the dragon isn't interested or is interested, and on it goes. And then the ending of that show is that, this will take me a while to find the slide, but this puppet, as you can see, is quite a striking kind of modernist design. It's partly that way because the wind wants to blow through it. It's a very big thing to have in the street. But it's designed by Carl Robertshaw, who's a kite designer. And it does indeed, at the end of the show, we turn it into a kite, a 20-metre wide kite, and it flies. So Plymouth is a really good place to do this because you can walk directly from the city centre to the cliff and fly straight off the cliff and go to Cornwall. And when you're making the show, you're mainly concerned with looking after 36 puppeteers, trying to communicate with hundreds of participants who are planting themselves in the city. You're trying to deal with all of that stuff. The logistics of it are really massive. Trying to look after those people and hold the space for those people and give them the feeling that they're having a satisfying experience. It's very, it's at the forefront of your mind. You're being a manager and a kind of coach and a director. And when we did it in Plymouth, I don't know if you remember in 2021, there was a shooting event in Plymouth, and that happened 2 days before we were due to do the show, and we immediately the council said we should not do the show, and the producers had a conversation and we rescheduled it for 2 weeks later, and so it was also right at the end of COVID. So when we walked through the city, we were still had this big question of, I don't know how people are going to react to this. It's obviously an expensive project right in the middle of the shopping centre, getting in the way of you going to the supermarket. And in both times we've done the hatchling, the response of the city has been incredibly moving and not something that I can easily handle, because it's partly because they're both cities where there's not much big arts events. Where you quite often were hearing people saying, this kind of thing doesn't happen here. I can't believe I had the opportunity to be involved in this, not just to watch it. People were really inspired by the fact that we taught local performers and not just brought a bunch of performers from London. So that definitely, has been a thing where, we thought we were making a big piece of art, but actually the real impact of it has been about participation, really. And, like you say, giving people an opportunity to do some puppetry or to be in something with a puppet and to sing their little song to a giant dragon and feel like they've been part of it. So, yeah, that's, thank you. What a lovely and good question. Thanks so much for listening. I hope I haven't run over too much. Yeah, have a lovely rest of the evening.